Brzezinski's Ghost Shapes Washington-Eurasia Geopolitics is the title of this article off New Eastern Outlook. One of the most outstanding features of a truly standing out Trump presidency to date is how precisely the actual policy developments, when we clear away the deliberate smoke and mirrors of tweets and scandal, follow a basic strategy of Washington geopolitics going back to at least 1992. This is the case in the latest unfortunate and quite illegal unilateral decision to leave the Iran nuclear agreement. This is also the case in the relentless Cold War-style demonization campaign against Russia and the deployment of insidious new sanctions. This is also the case with the looming trade war the Trump administration has initiated with the People's Republic of China. Don't think there's a good guy here, though, because geopolitically there is no good guy. Contrary to a widely held belief that Trump acts only out of impulse or is being unpredictable, I believe that the opposite is the case. Strategic geopolitical policies of the Trump administration are a response not of the president himself, but rather of the powers that be, the permanent establishment who actually control what is sometimes called the deep state. The geopolitics of that policy determines to a large degree who they allow to be president. The first official formulation of today's Washington foreign policy came in 1992 when Cheney was defense secretary under Bush Sr. The Soviet Union had collapsed and Bush triumphantly declared America as the sole superpower. Cheney's deputy secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, was responsible for developing a defense planning guidance from 1994 to 1999. It was blunt and later described by Ted Kennedy as imperialist. In part, the unedited Wolfowitz doctrine declared our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival either on the territory of the former USSR or elsewhere, to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. Under George W. Bush, the Wolfowitz doctrine reemerged as the Bush doctrine after 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War, declaring unilateralism and use of preventive war as central to U.S. policy. Going back to my title, I quote from the 1997 book of the late presidential advisors of Bignu Brzezinski, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives, to make the point of what U.S. foreign and defense policy under Trump today is. It is nothing less than application of the Brzezinski geopolitical challenge and the preventive war notion of the Bush-Wolfowitz doctrine in context of today's emerging resistance to an American sole superpower domination. Brzezinski was, of course, architect of Carter's Afghan war against the Soviet army using Mujahideen Islamic terrorists trained by the CIA, Saudi intelligence, and Pakistani ISI. In 1997, in the Grand Chessboard, he wrote it was imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus of also challenging America. Potentially the most dangerous scenario would be an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. A grand coalition of China, Russia, perhaps Iran. Averting this contingency will require U.S. geostrategic skill on the western, eastern, and southern perimeters of Eurasia simultaneously. When we add this to the recent Pentagon National Defense Strategy document that defines Russia and China as the greatest potential threat to the American hegemony, then combine this with the growing ties between Russia, China, and Iran since lifting of sanctions in 2015, especially in Syria, it becomes clear what Washington is doing. They're in an all-out effort to break what I call the Eurasian challenge into the sole hegemon, Russia, China, and Iran. As Brzezinski pointed out, for America's purposes of continued domination, it matters not that there are ethnic, religious, and other differences between Russia, China, and Iran. U.S. foreign policy ever since September 2001 has increasingly forced these three to cooperate despite those differences for what they see as defense of their national sovereignty, and this causes the Confederacy of Ezekiel 38 to form, the bear of Daniel chapter 7 that will come into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet, along with the three other beasts, the lion, which is symbolic of the West, the Christian nations, and then you have the leopard, which will be the infrastructure of this new world order, this one world political system that doesn't emerge until the woe of the fifth trumpet, the leopard being symbolic of the Kenites and their four hidden dynasties. Right now, they're the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. The great horn of the he-goat, in my opinion, is the United Nations. So the great horn of the he-goat, horns being symbolic of power, must first be broken before those four four notable ones, which are the four beasts written of in Daniel chapter 7 can emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet. The lion symbolizes the Christian nations, the bear the non-Christian nations, the he-goat becomes the leopard, the Kenites and their four hidden dynasties, and last but not least, Daniel's fourth beast, which is exclusively supernatural, made up of Satan and his angels. So there will be no New World Order until Satan and his angels are cast from heaven unto the earth. And as far as the United Nations being weakened and then replaced, you can read of that on the last page of the Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski. So going back to this article, look at the recent events in light of the Brzezinski Eurasia warning of 1997. Washington stood behind the UK in the bogus poisoning affair that was blamed with no proof on Russia. A fake chemical attack outside Damascus was then used as a pretext for the illegal US bombing raid, ignoring all precepts of the United Nations Charter and international law. That has to do with the breaking of the power of the United Nations, the great horn of the he-goat. That has to happen first, as we know from Daniel chapter 8, verse 8. That, in retrospect, was more of a test of possible Russia reaction. Whether or not US Tomahawk and other missiles hit or not, the precedent was set for Israel, that's Kenite-occupied Israel, and other US allies to escalate attacks on Iran and Syria. Don't think the Kenites are confined to Kenite-occupied Israel. Again, they're the he-goat, the shadow government that formulates the one world political system, the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. At the same time as Washington escalates pressure on Putin's Russia over Syria and Ukraine, they launch the early stage of what will clearly be a devastating economic war with China, using trade as the initial lever. Washington, as I pointed out in a previous article, the author of this article being F. William Engdahl, is aiming to force China to dismantle its strategy to bring China's economy over the next decade into leading status of high-tech producer. The strategy is called China 2025 and is the heart of the Xi Jinping strategic agenda and of his Belt Road Initiative or Economic Silk Road project. Now, over the vehement protests of Germany and France and other EU states, Trump unilaterally tears up the Iran nuclear agreement. The aim is clearly to reimpose crippling sanctions again on Iran, disrupting the feeble progress that was begun since 2015. As part of the latest development, Trump tearing up the nuclear agreement with Iran, the USA gives other countries like China or Japan or EU countries 180 days to end any purchase deals for Iran oil. The clear aim is to use the devastating new weapons of U.S. Treasury pinpoint sanctions to plunge Iran's fragile economy into crisis. If we step back from the specific details of each country and Washington actions against each, we see the three Eurasian powers, Russia, China, and Iran, are being systematically targeted, and so far with varying degrees of success. And again, the point of this is to cause the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy to come together. It's the negative part of God's plan, and after the great horn of the he-goat is broken, and I believe that to be the United Nations, Satan and his angels will be cast from heaven to earth, and then all four of those beasts rise up together in a one-world political system at the same time. The lion, the bear, the leopard, and Daniel's fourth beast. Daniel's fourth beast is the supernatural, Satan and his angels. There will be no New World Order, as they call it, until they're cast from heaven unto the earth. Soon after this global political system comes into being, it will receive a deadly wound, after which Satan will appear as the false Christ, the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 that comes from the fourth beast, because that's the supernatural. That's Satan appearing in his role of Antichrist. And then you see three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. That's the Christian nations, Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh. That's because they're no longer Christian nations from that point forward, because they cease to worship the true Christ and begin worshiping the false Christ. This is also when you see those three ribs in the mouth of the bear, the non-Christian nations, those three ribs also being symbolic of Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh, ceasing to be Christian nations at that time and becoming non-Christian nations, which is why you see them in the mouth of the bear. They all come together in a one-world religious system after Satan appears as the false Christ, the little horn of Daniel chapter 7, and the battle of the valley of Hamongog, written of in Ezekiel 38 and 39, does not happen until at the end of the 5-month-long hour of temptation. That's when the bear, the confederacy written of in Ezekiel chapter 38, comes against the mountains of Israel, that is to say the nations that the tribes were scattered to, specifically through Alaska, and at the same time as the battle of the valley of Hamongog, the battle of Armageddon transpires over where Jerusalem is, and that you can read of in Revelation chapter 19. The hailstones written of in the seventh vial, which is when the true Christ returns, happen at both battles, both the battle of the valley of Hamongog, written of in Ezekiel 38 and 39, as well as the battle of Armageddon that you can read of in Revelation chapter 19.